Hello, BookTube. It's been a while. I've been incredibly busy these last couple of weeks. I recently went on holiday to Vienna for 3 days and had a very enjoyable time there. And I thought I would close off the year by giving you my top 10 reading experiences for this year. It's a long list of books which greatly amused, entertained, and informed me over this year, and it was difficult to pare down the precise number and the precise books that I would pick for my video. But in the end, I settled on these 10, and we'll just go through them. So this is the first one. This is in no particular order, by the way. This is Dermot McCulloch's Magisterial, a thoroughly researched, comprehensive book about the first 3,000 years of Christianity. Now, those of you who know the history of Christianity well may well be asking yourselves that Christianity has only lasted for 2,000 years, so why does he have this title? And the 3,000 years is a nod to the first 1,000 years before Christianity and the Greek and Hebrew religions, which of course played such a big role in their own right in terms of the influence that Greek philosophy and Hebrew religion had on early Christianity, especially. So that is why McCulloch calls this the first 3,000 years, because he's including the first 1,000 years when Judaism and Greek culture were very much the dominating influences in that part of the Middle East where Christianity first emerged. So this is A History of Christianity by Dermot McCulloch. This is one of the finest books I have ever read. One of the finest history books, certainly, that I've ever read. It is a very thorough uh, history and analysis of the development of Christianity over many, many centuries. It goes all the way from its very earliest beginnings to the modern day, and its geographical reach is also equally comprehensive. It goes all the way from the Levant to India and even beyond. And you won't find many books that treat the subject as comprehensively as McCulloch does so here. So that is going to be my first uh, recommendation in terms of the top 10 books I read this year. Next, we have Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens, a book which I believe is probably his most underrated novel next to the Pickwick Papers. It is about the rather strained relationship between a very wealthy businessman and his daughter, who he neglects emotionally because of his rather patriarchal and all too common in this time period belief that a daughter is simply worth less than a son. And it just so happens that in this book, Mr. Dombey has a son that he is grooming to succeed him in the family business. Now, when his son, young Paul, dies fairly early on in the book, and dies very young, in fact, this only deepens the resentment that Mr. Dombey feels towards his daughter, and only further drives a wedge in their relationship. And this is the story of how, over many, many years, this estrangement deepens and festers until at the last moment there is a sort of reconciliation. There is a happy ending, a bittersweet ending, of course, but this is a book I immensely enjoyed. I think it contains some of Dickens' best prose. I think it is a very powerful watershed in terms of dividing his earlier works, his more amateurish works, from his later, more structured, more thought out works of fiction. So that is Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens, a work I strongly recommend. It comes right before David Copperfield, which I think is an inferior novel and a much overrated novel in contrast. So, Dombey and Son, if you've not read it, I encourage you to go away and read it. It is a magnificent story with a brilliant villain, one of the best villains I think that Dickens ever managed to create. So that is Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens. Next we have Middlemarch by George Eliot. And George Eliot is an author that needs no introduction. She is my favourite Victorian novelist, and she is by far, in my opinion anyway, I think the best of the great Victorian writers. And Middlemarch is the finest novel, in my opinion, from that period and possibly in all of English literature. It is about the fictional town of Middlemarch, which is based on Coventry, where George Eliot grew up, and it is about the lives that the inhabitants of this rather gossipy small town in the Midlands lead. It's about all of the trouble they get into, all of the entanglements, romantic, financial, that they get into. It's a story of idealism and how that idealism is crushed by the social mores and the stultifying conservatism of the local community. And it centers around the lives of two characters in particular, a woman named Dorothea and a man called Dr. Lydgate. And both of these protagonists are meant to be they are meant to represent the forces of progress and the forces of enlightenment, as opposed to the backwardness and the stultifying conservatism and bigotry of those around them. And we see how their good intentions are unfortunately thwarted by a combination of the local environment being not very conducive to what they're trying to achieve, but also their own mistakes, especially in the area of marriage. And I think the way in which George Eliot portrays them, and the way in which she draws their characters and sketches their lives and the events that happen to them, is quite simply astounding in terms of the sympathy and the realism that she brings to bear in how she writes about them. She makes Middlemarch feel like a real place, and her prose is simply breathtaking to behold. It is the most beautiful, it is the most inspiring, the most fulsome and fulgurating in terms of creative writing that you are ever likely to read. It's also quite difficult at times to pass, but I think that if you put in the mental effort, you will be rewarded. And this was actually a reread. This is I think, second time that I've read this. I read this earlier this year in the spring. This was my second time reading it, and I had a blast of a time. And as you can see, with all of these stickers I've put into it, I have made copious notes. I have made copious underlinings, as you can see. And this is a book which I hope to return to again and again over the coming years. Next, we have Don Juan by Lord Byron. This is probably the finest work of poetry that Byron ever put to paper. It was his last work of poetry. He died before he could finish it. This Penguin copy of it is actually increasingly rare to find. I don't believe Penguin actually publishes this anymore. It's out of print now. I only found this in a used copy on Amazon because I don't believe any new ones are being published, which is a shame, and it does go to show the change of literary tastes in terms of what people are purchasing nowadays. Lord Byron's rather antiquated style of epic poetry, I suppose, is no longer in vogue as it once was, which is a shame because Lord Byron in Don Juan is doing incredibly mind-bending things with poetry. He is pushing poetry in a very radical direction, and this is the culmination, really, of all of the experimenting and all of the poetic composition that he had been doing over the course of a very storied career in poetic writing. This is an adaptation of an old Spanish myth. Well, I say Spanish. It's really a Mediterranean myth. It's something which is shared, I think, by both the Spanish and the Italians, at least insofar as I know of its origins and of its national history. But this is about the rather lovelorn figure of Don Juan, known as Don Giovanni in Italian, and all of the escapades he goes into in his life. He is known popularly as a seducer, as someone who uses and then discards women. And this version of Don Juan that Byron writes about is actually a very different version of that from the kind of person that we have come to know through the popular myth. This is a version of Don Juan who is actually dominated by the women around him instead of being the one who dominates them. He is the one who is manipulated in this poem as opposed to being the one who manipulates others. And this is very much a commentary in some ways on Byron's own life and his own entanglements with various women, including his wife and also his mistress, Lady Caroline Lamb. And this is heavily autobiographical, although Byron would have denied this at the time. And if you know anything about his life, you can actually pass a lot of the references he makes to people he actually knew in his own life. This where can I find an appropriate portion to quote? Uh, well, I think one very good portion of this poem to quote would be the beginning, where he's making fun of some of his rival poets like Bob Southey, which never fails to put a smile on my face because Byron knows that what he's doing here is incredibly naughty and somewhat libelous. And it's no surprise that he was actually writing this poem, or a large part of it anyway, in exile. Bob Southey, you're a poet, poet laureate, and representative of all the race. Although 'tis true that you turned out a Tory at last, yours has lately been a common case. And now, my epic renegade, what are ye at with all the Lakers, in and out of place? The Lakers is a reference to the Lake District poets, such as Wordsworth and Coleridge, who Byron despised. A nest of tuneful persons, to my eye, like 24 blackbirds in a pie. So that goes to show the rather low opinion that Byron had of his fellow poets, particularly because they deserted the radical political causes that they held to when they were younger and became conservatives later in life, which Byron died too young to be able to do. He remained loyal to the cause of radicalism his entire life. If whether that would have changed had he grown older and more mature is unclear. But Lord Byron's Don Juan, a cracking read, some of the finest poetry in the English language. Next we have No Name in the Street by James Baldwin. This is a collection of non-fiction works. A very slim collection. I believe there are only 2 essays or 2 parts to this. Yes. So Take Me to the Water and To Be Baptized. So this is a collection of essays that Baldwin, the famous African-American anti-racism activist, had published when he was, well, this would have been in the 70s if I remember correctly. Yes, so this was published in 1972. So this is after the high water mark of the civil rights movement, when many of Baldwin's friends and associates had been assassinated or driven into hiding as a result of the counterattack of the American conservative establishment against the civil rights movement. And in this collection of essays, Baldwin recounts his sorrow, his anger, his frustration at what has happened to his beloved movement and to the friends and colleagues he knew over many years. And he also communicates a strong sense of betrayal, a sense that the white liberals, who were such staunch allies, have proven to be false friends, and that the promise of America that he so wanted to believe in had been proven to be a falsehood. And it's obviously a very sad work of nonfiction, a very angry work of nonfiction, in which Baldwin makes quite clear that he was developing in a much more radical direction politically. This contains some very positive words about the Black Panthers, which I am not so keen on, being someone who is no fan of Marxism, Leninism, or anything like that. But I can understand why Baldwin felt so angry and so disappointed that he was gravitating towards these rather dangerous figures. And the prose is first rate. It is written in the cadences of a street preacher, something that Baldwin, who was a child preacher, was actually groomed to be, and it's a world that he was very familiar with. It is written with his characteristic sense of moral outrage and his determination to proselytize his vision of a better world in which black and white can sit down together and actually identify their common humanity. And it's a very fulgurating and a very coruscating work of literature in which Baldwin is angrily trying to shake the American public out of its complacency about where the soul of its country is. So I would say that given what's happening in America right now, this is a very topical thing to be reading, and I would certainly encourage people to go out and read it and to see what the great writer had to say about so many of these issues, which are still very much part of our own time. So that is No Name in the Street. Next we have selected poems of William Wordsworth, uh, which I greatly enjoyed reading. Wordsworth is a poet that I have come to adore over this past year. I recently also had a chance to read the lyrical ballads, and they were also very good. This contains some of the lyrical ballads, not all of them, I don't believe, but a great many of them, as well as some of his other poetic works. And this is a generous selection. I think it concentrates more on the early to middle part of his career, as opposed to the late part of his career, when he was writing poems which aren't quite as critically acclaimed as the ones which you'll find here. And he wrote a lot of poetry in his lifetime. So this is a very good place to start if you're someone who wants to get into Wordsworth. Always try and get a select because a selected poems will usually have the best stuff. And this is a work which I greatly enjoyed reading over the course of the spring when I started reading it. So that is William Wordsworth's selected poems. He writes with a sense of awe, a sense of wonder. He writes in very plain but arresting poetic language, and I just really enjoy the diction and also the mood that he's trying to communicate, this sense of almost childlike wonder at the beauty of the natural world. And you have a very fitting picture on the front cover of this book, which mirrors very much what he was trying to achieve. So that is Wordsworth's selected poems. Next we have The Fall of Heaven by Andrew Scott Cooper, which is about the Iranian Revolution and the collapse of the Pahlavi dynasty, which ruled over Iran, and how that gave way to the current Islamist regime that rules over the Iranian people and brutalizes its own people and sponsors terrorism around the world. And it is written largely from the Pahlavi point of view. This is far from being an unbiased work of history. Most of the people who are interviewed for this book are people who are working for the Shah. But it is nevertheless an incisive, insightful, and deeply engrossing work of history. And I think that it is required reading for anyone who wants to understand modern Iran and wants to make sense of the events that led to the downfall of one of the oldest monarchies the world has ever seen. And you have a wonderful picture there of the Shah himself and his wife, Queen Farah, who is still alive in exile, although a very old woman now. And what can I say? This was a cracking read, written almost as if it was a novel. There was something novelistic about the way in which Scott Cooper retells the story of one of the greatest uh, downfalls, one of the greatest tragedies in modern times, the downfall of a modernizing nation and a modernizing regime at the hands of a counter-revolution, an Islamist counter-revolution that brought about the destruction of so much progress and so much enlightenment that was going on in that country at that time. So that is The Fall of Heaven by Andrew Scott Cooper. We next have The Third Reich in Power by Richard J. Evans. This is part of Richard Evans's famous Third Reich trilogy. The first book he wrote was the Coming of the Third Reich. This is the second one, and the third one is The Third Reich at War. I could have chosen any one of those, I feel, although I thought that this was probably the most topical in terms of the events we are currently seeing around the world, where we see these right-wing populist governments coming to power and seeking to entrench their rule and to essentially make it impossible for them to be overthrown. And this is the story of how the Nazis set about institutionalizing their power once they had managed to filch power, essentially. Once they had managed to con Hindenburg and his allies into giving them power. And this is about how they set about propagandizing the population, how they set about proselytizing, how they set about separating the Jews from the German nation, and bit by bit, through all sorts of legal and extra-legal means, separating them, excluding them from the body politic, and making them fair game to be discriminated against, to be beaten, to be killed, to be thrown out of the country, to be swindled, extorted. All of this in preparation, of course, for the ultimate process of elimination that would become the Holocaust. So this is a very sobering read, a very topical read, probably the definitive work on what the Nazis did when they were in power, from one of the foremost historians of Nazism in the English-speaking world. And next we have another Nazi book, which is this biography of Hitler by the German historian and journalist Volker Ullrich. This is actually a 2-volume biography. I've only read the first volume. This is an attempt to present a more multidimensional Hitler than the Hitler that has become well known in popular culture. We have this image of Hitler, this fixed image, as this ranting lunatic who just wanted to conquer the world and who only ever cared about politics and about power. And actually, the Hitler that is presented in this book is a somewhat more complex Hitler than we have come to imagine. One thing which Ulrich does well in this book is to show us how the image Hitler sought to project of himself as this man who was wholly given over to politics and to making Germany a great power was actually a mirage. and that the real Hitler, in fact, did have a private life, which he did his best to keep concealed. But nevertheless, in so many ways, our understanding of Hitler is very much something that he imposed on the imagination of his people as a deliberate tactic, because he was trying to present a certain ideal of himself, and that ideal didn't fully line up with the real person. But this was a fascinating read. I want to get my hands on the second volume at some point and read that as well. Lastly, we have Ronald Hutton's magnificent biography of Oliver Cromwell. This is actually part of a planned trilogy. The second volume of this book came out earlier this year, and I've read that one as well. I could have put either one of those on the top 10 list. This is magnificent work on the life of Oliver Cromwell. Will probably become the definitive work on this incredibly elusive and yet so significant figure in British history. And the stuff that Ronald Hutton does with the primary sources in this book is simply first rate. The detective work he does in checking them off against one another, in going back to the original sources and reading them again, looking at them in a new light. All of this is simply first rate historical work and should be studied as an example of the historian's craft and how to do your job properly as an academic. So this is the making of Oliver Cromwell. This goes from 1599, when he was born, all the way to 1640 or 1642. Let me double check that. Yes, so this goes all the way from 1599 to 1642, which is the year of the Civil War, and that's when Cromwell first started to see real action in terms of a military commander during this rather tumultuous period in British history. So that is The Making of Oliver Cromwell by Ronald Hutton, and those are the 10 books which I wanted to share with you in terms of the books which I really enjoyed and got a lot out of this year. I could have chosen many books, but I settled on these 10 in the end as the books I wanted to focus on. You'll notice that they lean heavily towards non-fiction. Earlier this year, I was trying to read more of literature, mostly poetry, and I seem to have veered towards non-fiction as the year has gone on. But I hope that that was an insightful and an enjoyable watch for you. I hope that you'll go away and read a couple of those books, which I held up here for you. And feel free to tell me what you thought of this video. Feel free to tell me if you've read any of these books before and what your opinion of them is. And I will be signing off for now. Take care, BookTube. Hope to see you soon again.